ladies and gentlemen. Happy Sabbath. So this is the fourth part of the series. I know some of you are like, 4 parts? Really? That's 1 part too many. I get it. This is all about the Nephilim, and I thought it was such an interesting topic. This is why it's gone on this far. You can watch parts 1, 2, and 3. They're already on our YouTube channel at Palm Harbor SDA. You will find it there. I will just briefly point out to you that if you haven't made it this far, I will give a brief review. So we'll go all the way back up to the beginning. So brief. But either way, the point is that one of the things that I mentioned in the very beginning about this whole idea of the Nephilim is the concept that many people believe that it's aliens, fallen angels, the idea that aliens or fallen angels mated with men and created this race of super giants that lived on the earth long ago, and this is what caused the flood. And I talked about the Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha and their role in shaping this narrative. I mentioned how the Hebrew even shows that these were giants. I showed in the other parts of the Bible that there were giants literally all over the place in the Old Testament, how God's people had to fight the giants and overcome them, how there were giants in Abraham's day. I mentioned specifically how the evidence shows that there's a difference between the sons of God and daughters of men, and that it really has to do with 2 different groups of people, the children of Seth and the children of Cain. I mentioned all those things, and you can watch that. And so it's important when you get to this point in the 4th part that you understand that there's a greater truth, that yes, it mentions giants, yes, it mentions everything that happens before the flood, but there's a greater truth that I think we have ignored because it actually speaks directly to us and this day. And so that's what we're going to do here in part 4 of the Nephilim, is we're going to talk about the application of this truth and actually the downfall of society. Because I really do think that what we read in Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 4, is the beginning of the downfall of society. Think about it. The Lord floods the entire earth right after what we read there. So once we get back all the way to it, I was excited at first. I thought I could get all the way to the top, but I didn't realize I had so many slides. There we go. Okay. So here's the passage in question. Genesis chapter 6, and we'll start in verse 1. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, all of whom they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men of old, men of renown. That's what it says here. And again, that's the idea. And then I want you to see this. I want you to see this here, the next few verses. So this is what we have here. We find that the sons of God marry the daughters of women, and they have children. And then we see that some of them are tyrants or giants. And then we see in verse 5. So notice what happens here. It says, verse 5, Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Now, I just want to stop right here. In between Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, and Genesis chapter 6, verse 6, between these here, what sins has anyone committed? It doesn't even, listen, if you read carefully, do you see anything here about child human sacrifice? You don't. Do you see anything here about amalgamation? You don't. That doesn't mean that those things weren't happening. But the writer of Genesis has chose to focus on one thing, and one thing only, to talk about the sin that created the downfall of the world. Indeed, if you read other flood narratives, whether it be ancient Ugaritic, whether you read the Enuma Elish, or whatever, whether you read any of these stories about the flood, whether you read about the Mayans, the Aztecs, they have their flood tradition as well, or the ancient Chinese, they have their flood tradition as well, you will read all sorts of reasons for why the earth was flooded. Some will say that the people of the earth were too loud, that the idea that they were worshiping all the gods so loud that it annoyed the gods and they flooded the earth. You will find that they rebelled against God and God wiped them out. That's the Greeks. You will find that the people were wicked and terrible, and they were awful human beings, and they were proud, and that's why they were destroyed. But notice none of those reasons are there. And even in our own literature, we read about amalgamation. And so None of that's here in this passage. And you think about it, notice you literally go from the sons of God marrying the daughters of women to verse 5, that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. I mean, how do you make that jump? And why is it that Moses doesn't say anything else about any other sins? There's no doubt that there was worshiping idol. There was no doubt that there was murder. There was no doubt that there was adultery. There was no doubt that terrible things went on. But Moses mentions none of it here. Notice what he does say. And it says, and then right after that, he says what? And he says, and every intent of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Again, the list of sins that he could put there is not there. He starts with one thing, marriage. And then verse 7, it says, and the Lord said, I will destroy men whom I've created from the face of the earth, both men and beasts, creeping things, and birds of the air, and I am sorry I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Now this contrast gets even worse when you realize just 2 chapters ahead, 2 chapters in the end of Genesis chapter 4, we read in verse 25 through 26, it says, and Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son named Seth, for God had appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. And as for Seth, to him a son was born who he named Enosh. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. So at the end of chapter 4, we have men calling upon the name of the Lord. In chapter 5, and we're not going to read the whole thing, we have Enoch who walks with the Lord 300 years and is translated with God. So we go from chapter 4, the end of it, the sons of God, the men calling on the name of the Lord. In chapter 5, we have Enoch being translated with God. And then we go to chapter 6, and God's willing to pull the plug on the whole thing and destroy it. And only thing that we read really about their sins or what happened, the big change, is right there in the very beginning. Genesis 6, verses 1 and 2. Now it came to pass when the men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, and the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives from themselves of all whom they chose. It sounds crazy that you're going to flood the earth because this was their sin? You're going to wipe out men, women, and children because this was their sin? How so? How could this be? Well, I want you to hear this. This is from Matthew Henry. This is what he says. And I thought this was very interesting because of how he sets it up. This is what he says here. He's commenting, he starts on verse 2 and he works his way all the way to verse 4. It says 2, mixed marriages. The sons of God, that is, the professors of religion, who were called by the name of the Lord and called upon that name, married the daughters of men, that is, those that were profane and strangers to God and godliness. The posterity of Seth did not keep by themselves as they ought to have done, both by preservation of their own purity and in detestation of the apostasy. They intermingled themselves with the excommunicated race of Cain. They took to themselves wives of all that they chose. But what was amiss in these marriages? They chose only by the eye. They saw that they were fair, which was all they looked at. They followed the choice which their own corrupt affections made. They took all that they chose without advice and consideration. But that they proved that such bad consequences to them was that they married strange wives and were unequally yoked, and they were unequally yoked with unbelievers. This was forbidden to Israel, Deuteronomy 7:3 and 4. It was the unhappy occasion of Solomon's apostasy, 1 Kings 11, 1 through 4. And it was the bad consequence of the Jews after the return out of Babylon, Ezra 9, 1 and 2. Note, professors of religion in marrying both themselves and their children should make conscience of keeping within the bounds of the profession. The bad will sooner debauch the good than the good reform the bad. Those that profess themselves the children of God must not marry without his consent. Which is why they have not if they join themselves in affinity with his enemies. So notice he, just like what we see in Moses in Genesis chapter 6, he says, look, this is what happened. In marrying and doing whatever they wanted, it's corrupted the race of men who called upon the name of the Lord, and that was the beginning of the end for the earth. But is it really true? Can one mistake in marriage corrupt all of society? Are we living in a time where marriage is just the failure of marriage? People saying love is love, we get to do whatever we want? Is this really corrupting and destroying society? Well, before we go any further, what are we going to do? We're going to pray. So let us bow our heads. Gracious and Heavenly Father, We thank you so much for this time that we have together. We ask, Lord, that you be with us as we open up your word and we wrestle with your scriptures. Help us, Lord, to be like Bereans, to see if these things are so, and examine them and test them, and that they may dwell in our hearts so that we may learn from it. In Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen. Amen. So let's start in the very beginning. Let's start in the very beginning, because I want you to see something here, that the foundation of society is marriage, period. So let's go right here, Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 28. Then God said, let us make man in our image, to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. And in the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. Now, I just want to stop right here. If you followed the series, I talk about giants, and I talk about the image of God, and I talk about the height and stature and health and vitality and all those things, which are all true. But there's also something else you have to understand here. That when he made male and female in the image of God, he also endowed them with a sense of understanding and knowledge and intelligence and a sensitivity towards the things of God. He didn't just make a blank slate. He downloaded things into their lives and their beings, so they could be part of the community of heaven. That's what he did. So not only were they in the image of God physically, but they were also in the image of God morally. And this is important. So in this high state of exalted existence that we have not seen since the fall of Adam, this is how they lived. And notice what he does. In the next verse, he says, then God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So right away, man in his exalted state, he has them married. That's the first thing. He sets up the institution of marriage. And then right after the institution of marriage, which happens on the 6th day, what does he do on the 7th day? He rests. So 2 institutions before the flood, marriage and the Sabbath. We could talk about the Sabbath and the downfall of society as well, but today we're just talking about marriage. But this was the very first institution. Notice the idea is that to multiply and fulfill the earth was to first do what? To have a stable marriage, to have a stable family, through marriage and children, to create a stable community, to create a church, to create a society, and to fill the whole world with a population. That was the idea. But it starts with marriage in the image of God. Indeed, Genesis 2. Again, think about it. Moses puts this down twice about the importance of marriage here, showing that God ordained it from the very beginning as a blessing to mankind and indeed a blessing to the entire world. It was part of the heritage of man. Genesis chapter 2, starting verse 18, he says, And the Lord God said, It is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable to him. Out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called each living creature, that's what his name. So Adam gave the names to all the cattle, the birds of the air, to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found a helper comparable to him. And the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall on Adam, and he slept. And he took one of the ribs, and he closed up the flesh in its place. Then the rib which the Lord had taken from man, he made into woman, and he brought her to man. And then Adam said, This is now the bone of my bones, the flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore man shall leave father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And notice this. This is how serious that marriage is. Today, we don't put men to sleep and take their rib out and grow a wife for them. That doesn't happen anymore. But that doesn't mean that the sanctity, the holiness, the unity of marriage isn't understood in that. The idea is that men and women, in being joined together in marriage, are to become one flesh. They are to be joined together. This is how serious it is. That God sets it up, that Adam understands it. And this is done in purity and holiness. And this is the foundation, indeed, of the world. Right here, at the beginning of the world, only one day has gone by. Actually, the week isn't even over, and this has already happened because marriage is the foundation. Indeed, if we go back to Matthew chapter 19, notice how Jesus talks about the importance of marriage, because the Pharisees and Sadducees have issues with divorce. In those days, they could divorce their wives for burning their food. Some men have thought about divorcing their wives for burning the food, but that's not in the Bible, so don't do that. But Matthew 19, he says, Now it came to pass, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he departed from Galilee and came to the religion of Judea beyond the Jordan, and the great multitudes followed him, and he healed some of there. Then the Pharisees came to him, testing him and saying, is it lawful for man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And so notice they're trying to pit him against Moses because they probably have an idea that Jesus is going to say that, no, you shouldn't just get divorced for any reason. And so they want to bring up Moses and say Jesus is contradicting Moses. Unfortunately for them, Jesus is going to cite Moses himself. And so this is what he says. He says, he answered them, have you not read that he who made them in the beginning, male and female, and said, for this reason, man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So notice now the trap is sprung, and they say, right, then why did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? Right? They think they have him. And notice what he says. He said to them, Moses, because the hardness of the heart permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning. Notice, what is he appealing to? The standard in Genesis. This is the standard for marriage, Genesis. This is what he's saying. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So notice even Jesus, in his understanding of marriage, appeals right back to the very standard of Genesis. This is how important it is. And again, it says something about the society that existed with the Pharisees, that they were allowing divorce for all kinds of insane reasons. And so Jesus puts it right back on the standard. No, this is the standard. It doesn't matter what you say, no matter what you think, this is the standard. And this should always be the standard. Marriage is so important that we even see that it's connected to the covenant blessing with Abraham. It is connected to him because in order to be a father, you must have a wife and your son must have a mother. That's just the way it works. And so notice in the covenantal blessing to Abraham, and even the change of his name is wrapped around the idea of him being married in a covenant-keeping relationship. Notice Genesis 17, 1 through 6. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram, the father of height, that's what the name Abram means, or exalted father, father of height, and said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless. And I will make a covenant between me and you and multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face and God talked with him, saying, as for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of many nations. No longer shall you be called Abram, exalted father, or father of height, but you shall be called Abraham, father of a multitude. For I have made you the father of many nations, and I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And so notice here, the blessing, the covenantal blessing that goes to Abraham must come through a sanctified marriage. Think about it, that even the covenantal promises are promised to Abraham, him being a father, is through marriage. And notice what he says here, and this is part of the reason why it's the marriage and the home is so important. Notice what he says here in Genesis 18, verses 29. For I've known him, in order that he may command his children, his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring Abraham what he has spoken to him. So notice, it's not just in marriage, but it's also in what he's going to do next. He's going to raise godly children. So we start with marriage and we go to family, but this is the way the covenantal blessing was to pass. Indeed, when you read the genealogies, which we usually roll our eyes at and we're like, oh, can I just get through it fast enough? Notice it goes from father to son, father to son, father to son, father to son. Why? Why does it do that? Because the idea that the knowledge of God should be in the home. And once it's in the home, it should go from father to son to all the children, not just to the son. There was a son chosen, generally the firstborn, was chosen as a particular repository to keep the truth. But every child born in that family was to know the truth. Every child was to know who God was. And this is how the blessing was passed down. This is how important marriage was. Indeed, it was so important, and Abraham understood this, that in Genesis chapter 24, notice what happens here. Sarah has died, and Isaac is now in his early 40s, and Abraham is getting older, and he knows that Isaac needs to have a wife. And so what does he do? He decides to go to his servant, and notice what he says here to his servant. So verse 2, Genesis 24, verse 2. So Abraham said to his oldest servant of his house, who ruled over all he had, please, put my hand under your thigh. Now, I love this. I love this idea. We don't do this today. This is definitely a custom. But if someone were to be sitting, right, and you put your hand under their thigh, what have you done? What have you done when you do that? Well, if I were to walk over to my brother here and I put my hand on his thigh and I do this, we're looking eye to eye. And as a matter of fact, we're so close, we can see the whites of their eye and all the defects of our teeth. But the point is that Abraham, this is so serious that he goes, come here. Put your hand underneath my thigh. Look at me right in the face. Now, he's not angry, but this is how serious. Look at me right in the eyes, and let me tell you what you must do. You've been over everything in my house, all the money I have, all the goats, all the sheep, everything. But nothing is more important than what I'm going to do, what you're going to do right now. So that's why he says he puts his hand under his thigh, and he says, put my hand under my thigh and swear. This is serious. By the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. In other words, look at me, right in the face, look eye to eye. Whatever you do, you will not give my son to marry a woman from the Canaanites, from the people. Whatever happens to me, you promise me right now, man to man, that you will not do that, and you will do this before the Lord our God. And so notice what happens. But you shall go to my country and to my family and take a wife for my son. Isaac. In other words, take my wife for someone who believes. Abraham doesn't even care about his entire fortune because he knows it would all be lost if this marriage is not cemented in the right way. He knows that the blessings and everything can be completely jettisoned if this marriage doesn't go right. And that's how serious it is to him. He recognizes that. Even like a lot of times we talk about Jacob and Esau, and we talk about him selling the birthright blessing. We talk about Esau selling it for lentil soup or chili. It just depends on where you're from. It gets more creative. Vegetable soup, minestrone if you're Italian. It doesn't matter. Whatever it is, he sold his birthright for merely food. He sold what was to be eternal for something temporal, and that's where we always point to. But we forget that Esau had already disqualified himself from this birthright by other actions that he had already done. Here we are in Genesis chapter 26, and this is what it says. Chapter 26, verses 34 and 35. He says, when Esau was 40 years old, he took wives of Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basmath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite. So right away, Esau has already disqualified himself. He's married 2 idolatrous women. This is one of the reasons why his mother was willing to do whatever she could to deceive Isaac, which was wrong, to stop this, because she knew this would be a problem. She knew this would be a problem, and even Isaac knew this would be a problem. But unfortunately, he was blinded when he made that decision. But notice what it says here, in this verse here. When Esau was, it looks like I put it twice, but here's verse 35. And they were a grief. They were a grief of the mind of Isaac and Rebekah. And I think I put it in a different version. It says NKJV for both. But read verse 35 again. And they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah. And I think that's actually the NIV. I said NKJV, but it's the NIV. But notice, they were bitter because they knew what this meant. That how are you going to have godly seed? How are you going to raise up children to know the Lord when you've married 2 idolatrous women? It doesn't matter how strong Esau is. It doesn't matter how much of a man he is and he commands his home. If his wives are worshiping idols, it's going to be bad for them. His kids are not going to receive it. And so this was a great pain and hurt to both Isaac and Rebekah. This was the first step that really disqualified him from receiving the birthright blessing. Even probably more so than selling his birthright for a mere morsel of food. And indeed, it's so important that when they come to the land after 400 years living in Egypt, that Moses then again tells them about the importance of not marrying those who don't believe. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, starting in verse 1, when the Lord your God brings you to the land which you go to possess, and cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. Nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughters to their son, nor take their daughters to your son, for they will turn your sons from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars and break down their sacred pillars and cut down their wooden images and burn their carved images with fire. In other words, what is he saying here? You cannot intermingle with these guys. You can't make covenants with them. Your job is to destroy their altars. You will not tolerate their idolatry anywhere in the land. You will not marry their daughters. You will not bring their sons in your lives. You won't do this. Why? Why? Because it's understood. Moses understands this. And this is possibly why he writes what he does in Genesis 6. That when you mess up on that first step of marriage, society itself falls apart. Perhaps that's what he understood. Indeed, we find here in the book of Ezra, chapter 9, we find the same thing that Ezra gets very upset about them with. And notice what he says here, verse 9, or chapter 9, verse 1. It says, when these things were done, the leaders came to me saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land with respect to the abomination of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. So what are they saying? So you have to understand what has happened here in the book of Ezra. So many of you who are in our Bible study on Friday night, you will know that we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, and we're talking about Jeremiah and his warnings that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Well, this is after Jerusalem is destroyed in 586. God's people have come back to the land. So this is well into 457, which is another important date. This is many years later. They're in the land and they're rebuilding everything, and the priests and the Levites are already there, and instead of doing what the Lord has asked them, they have joined themselves to the pagan people of the land, including an intermarriage. The very thing that we just read in Deuteronomy 7 that they shouldn't do, and yet this is the reason why they were destroyed, and yet they come back in the land and they do the very same sins that caused them to lose the land to begin with. And so verse 2, it says, for they have taken some of the daughters as their wives for themselves and their sons. So the holy seed is mixed as the people of those lands. Indeed, the hand of the leaders and the rulers has been foremost in the trespass. In other words, they're like, hey, it doesn't really matter what the Lord wants. We're going to get back to the temple, the ritual, Sabbath keeping. It doesn't matter about marriage. And notice that they're upset because, yes, it does matter. Yes, it does matter what you do in this. It's interesting. Brief aside, it's funny, if you go to buy a house today, everyone tells you do your due diligence. If you were to invest a large sum of money in the stock market even, they tell you do your due diligence. If you start a business, they tell you to do your due diligence. And sometimes if you have enough money, you hire a business broker or you hire someone to help you do the research in the house. And if it's a house, you get a home inspector. And then you look at years to see what the taxes are. You look at the flood zone. You look at the schools around there. You look at the crime rates. You look at all this to buy a house for a mortgage that you might have for 30 years. But when it comes to marriage, you do none of that. Not one time. You're not like, well, let me look carefully. This woman that I'm interested, what about her family? What about her siblings? What does she believe? We don't do any of that. For a house, we will spend more time and more money investigating to see if it's a good investment that we might have between 10 and 30 years. But for marriage, it's just a matter of the heart. And so notice that these guys did exactly that. Well, when it comes to marriage, we're keeping the Sabbath. We have the temple. We're making sacrifices. We're saying the prayers. We're singing the songs. Marriage, not a big deal. And yet Ezra's like, no, this is the big deal. As a matter of fact, it's such a big deal, as I mentioned, that is the foundation of the home, the foundation of the church, the foundation of society, as we see from Genesis from the very beginning. And so what happens? Well, this is Ezra's own response. So when I heard this thing, I tore my garments and my robe and plucked out some of the hair of my head and beard and sat down astonished. This is the idea that he's sitting there and he's like, I can't believe it. How is it that we as a people have received this great mercy to return to this land which we had been kicked out of because of the idolatry and wickedness, and yet here we are back in the land doing the very same things that we were condemned for? How is this? Are we not learning anything? This is the idea that he's completely stunned by this. And then he says right here, he says, I sat astonished at the evening sacrifice. And then in verse 12, he basically has them do something that's pretty impressive. He actually has them separate. He says, look, we're done with this. And while I think that this would be difficult medicine today, it was medicine that they needed back then, and he actually had them separate their families right then and there because it was that important. It's not saying that should be the rule, that's the exception, but notice how severe it was that he literally has them cut them off for that very reason. Now we go to Malachi. This is also in the post-exile times, and Malachi has an issue with the church at that time, their wickedness. And so he's condemning them for their idolatry. And of course, usually the language of idolatry usually comes in the language of marriage, adultery, and divorce, because that's the idea that if marriage is the foundation, of the home, the church, society, right? If that's the case, this is why idolatry, which is considered worshiping other gods, is linked to marriage, because of the foundation of our faith in God. When we put other things before God, we are separating ourselves from God. And so notice what he says here, verse 10. This is Malachi chapter 2, verse 10. Have we not one Father? Has not God created us? Why do we deal treacherously with one another by profaning the covenant of our fathers? Judah has dealt treacherously. An abomination has been committed in Israel and Jerusalem. For Judah has profaned the Lord's holy institution, which he loves. He has married the daughter of a foreign god. Now this is interesting because this is twofold. On one hand, they're engaged in idolatry, but on the other hand, God's people are marrying foreign women as well. That's the double thought there going on. Verse 12. May the Lord cut off from the tents of Jacob the man who does this, being awake and aware, yet who brings an offering to the Lord of hosts. So what is he saying? And that there's these people who have been worshiping idols and engaged in these illicit marriages, and they literally come to the temple and they're offering their gifts. Oh, I'm here to make a sacrifice. I'm here to sing a song. I'm here to teach. And he's like, no. When you're living in sin, you're done. You can't be doing this. Your life is separate from God. The way you're living contradicts everything you're doing, including the very sacrifice you make and the words that you say. And so he goes on. And he says, and then he goes on to talk about more of the things they do. And he says, and this, the second thing you do, you cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and crying. Now, I love this. I love this because you can imagine people going there and crying, Lord, please give us a harvest. Lord, help my children get better. Lord, please, I'm struggling. Lord, the taxes are too high. Lord, whatever it is that they're wrestling with. And these are sincere prayers. I don't think the tears are merely fake. But they're crying and they're hoping for the Lord to intercede. And so what does he say? It's so bad and so annoying to him that the second part of the verse reads thus. So he does not regard the offering anymore, nor receive it with good will from your hands. So even though the people are crying and weeping and begging the Lord to do something, it gets annoying to him. He doesn't want to hear it. Why? This is what they ask in verse 14. Yet you say, for what reason? Why does the Lord ignore our crying? Why does the Lord ignore our sacrifice? Notice what he says here. Because the Lord has witness between you and the wife of your youth, with whom you have dealt treacherously. Yet she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Did he not make them one? It goes right back to Genesis. Did he not make the two one flesh? Having a remnant of the Spirit. And why one? So in other words, did he not join man and woman to be together one? And why does he make man and woman one? Why does he not join them? Why does he join them in a holy covenant? Why? Because God seeks godly offspring. Therefore take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously with the wife of your youth. So notice, the point is that because in their marriages, they're crying out, Lord, help me with my harvest. Help me make my bills. Help me get out of debt. Help me, Lord, to do the things that I know that you want me to do. Help me to preach better. Help me to do this. But it doesn't matter to God. It's actually annoying to him because they have dealt corruptly with the wives who they were made to live with. Covenant relationship, a covenant marriage. And so verse 17, he continues the same theme. You have wearied the Lord with your words, yet you say, in what way have we wearied him? In that you say, everyone who does evil is good in the sight of the Lord, and he delights in them. Or where is the God of justice? And I love this because this is often the case. When we engage in sin, when we have broken away from God, we lose the feeling of how evil is. We lose the exceedingly sinfulness of sin. And when we lose the exceedingly sinfulness of sin, we become like Uzzah and feel that we have right to touch the Ark of the Covenant. But God says no. God says absolutely not. This is why you weary me, because you treat your wives poorly, your men marry idolatrous women, and you no longer have a fear of God before your eyes. You think you can live any which way you want, that the Lord, where's the God of justice? He's not going to do anything to it. And everyone who is evil is good in the sight of God. This is what Malachi has to say. But most importantly, this revolves around the corruption of marriage, which is what we see in Malachi 2. Indeed, marriage is so important in the church that even the order of the church and how it's to be understood is sort of wrapped around this marriage language. Even what we read here in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 15, has a lot to do with the home, and we'll read even more in the next section. It says, I desire therefore that men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. Remember, they prayed in their days like this. That's the idea of holy hands. I don't know what other churches are doing one of these. I'm not sure what that is. Is that window washing? I don't know. But the idea was that they lifted up their hands like this to pray. He says, in like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair, gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Let a woman learn in silence and all submission. And I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Now notice that Paul's argument isn't here that women have a testosterone deficiency. He's going back to the order of creation. And the reason why he's doing this is because this was the idea of the home. This was the idea of the home, that the man was to be the head of the house. And this doesn't mean that a man gets to act any which way he wants. He's accountable to God. We just read in Malachi chapter 2 that if a man deals treacherously with his wife, no matter how much he cries, his prayers aren't going to be answered. Period. So you don't get to do that. But notice here that even in the church, the order of the church is to be the way that it was to be established in the godly home. That's the idea here. Now, many people will say, well, this idea, let women learn in silence and all submission, and he doesn't permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man, but to be in silence. We often say, well, this is just, this is the first century Jewish sort of culture. Paul's kind of a reprobate in this. It's not even, as a matter of fact, some people even think that this isn't even inspired. But I hate to tell you, it's all inspired. But what you find here is you have to know this, that in those days, they did have priestesses. They did have women who officiated religious services. They had women that led out everything. As a matter of fact, their society was much like ours in the sense that they let women lead, and there was sexual immorality everywhere. There were women who led out in the temples. There were women who were priestess for fertility rites, for nature rites. I mean, they were everywhere. They were everywhere. And so Paul's point is that that's not the order of the home. That's not the order of the home. That's not the order of the church. And that isn't happening here. And that's his point. They weren't going to be like the world. They weren't going to sit there and worship women and exalt them over men. That was never going to be the case. And yet, we see that today. And so notice what he says here. And this is important also because it gets back to the home. What does he say here? Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived and fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she'll be saved if she becomes a CEO of a Fortune 500 company and makes $1 million and goes on vacation every single year. That's not what it says. It doesn't say anything about that. What does it say? Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Now, why would he say that? Is it because he wants women pregnant and barefoot in the kitchen? Is that what he wants? No. It's because the right of raising children is so sacred and so holy that someone needs to be there accountable. And it has been chosen for women to do that lot. And it is not, when women think that their job is to be boss babes and CEOs and all that, they have realized that their greatest responsibility they will ever have is shepherding little tiny souls into eternity. That is the greatest responsibility. And we have, as a people and as a church, we have said, no. We're going to lift women up on high. We're going to make them the greatest thing ever. And in doing that, we've actually robbed women of happiness and their purpose in this world. That's what we've done. And Paul's point was, that's not happening on my watch. That's why he says what he says. Because the order of the home directs the order of the church, and it maintains society. Notice that Paul says this again. He says almost the same thing here, but different, because he's talking about someone who's going to be an elder. The word bishop is the word episkopos in Greek, and it can also be translated elder. So don't think that he's thinking about the Catholic Church when he says bishop. So 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. For this is a faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop must then be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous. Now notice this. The last one is, to me, one of the most important, because this one, all of them are important, but this one is important because of the analogy that he says in verse 5. So pay attention here. It says, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? So notice, In order for him to have children, in order for him to have a home, he must be married, as God designed with Adam and Eve. He must be married. This is how important that marriage was, that to be a leader of the church, you needed to have a home, you needed to have godly children, you needed to have a home that ran well, because if you did, you'd know how to run a church. And think about what we have today. And I'm guilty of it too. How many churches fail because we have men in there who do not know how to run their home, or have broken marriages, or chose poorly? How many churches suffer just for this one instance right here? This one qualification, we have ignored it. We have dismissed it as it's not important. But if it wasn't important, why would Paul put it here? Why would he put it here? And why would he use the analogy that if a man cannot rule his household well, how will he take care of the church? That's his whole point. Again, this is the value of marriage. This is why when we're going through this whole concept of marriage, it is important to understand this. So we'll go on to the next one. And again, this is Paul again in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And I'll just read right here verses 14 and 15. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, for what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ with Belial? Or what does a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are a temple of the living God. So notice his point in marriage is that if you are a temple of the living God where you're wanting the Holy Spirit to dwell, don't attach yourself to someone who's not. That's his point. How can you do this? This is how serious it is. In the language here, it's meant to be serious. How can you join your Christ with Belial, the worthless one, or Satan himself? How can you join a temple of God with a temple of idols? It's how serious it is. How can you join light with darkness? It cannot be, because he understands if you do this, it will be the downfall of the church. And the downfall of the church will be the downfall of society, and so on and so forth. And so notice here in Matthew chapter 24, we're going to get back to what Jesus says, because Jesus also talks about before the flood. And notice what he says here in verse 37. But as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days of Noah before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. It did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Now notice, again, Jesus could have talked about all the sins that existed back then, just like Moses could have. Moses in Genesis 6 could have listed all the sins. And again, if you read the extra biblical literature, you'll find a lot of them. Some of them were probably true. Jesus could have listed it as well, but what does he say? They were ambivalent to the things of God because they were marrying and giving in marriage, and they were eating and drinking, irrespective of what God would have them do. That's what they did. And that's his point, that they were living and doing these things which are good in themselves, but they were being abused to the point that it corrupted society. And so much so that they didn't even realize the flood was coming and they were destroyed. They would not heed the warnings. So notice Jesus, like Moses, is pointing out the downfall of society starts right then and there. And again, this is what we read in Genesis 6. I'm not going to read it again, but you can see it right here. The idea that just before the flood comes, what's the first misstep? That the sons of God marry the daughters of women, and the society becomes corrupt. Now, I'm not the only one to make this comparison. John Wesley talks about it. This is what he says. Men began to multiply on the face of the earth. This was the effect of the blessing. Yet man's corruption is so abused by this blessing that it is turned into a curse. The sons of God, those who were called by the name of the Lord and called upon that name, married the daughters of men. Those that were profane and strangers of God. The posterity of Seth did not keep themselves as they ought, but intermingled with the race of Cain. They took wives of all whom they chose. They only chose by the eye, for they saw that they were fair, which is all they looked for. So he mentions that this corruption starts with marriage, that the downfall of the pre-flood world starts with the failure of marriage. Adam Clarke says the same thing. Listen to what Adam Clarke says. He says, it was not at this time that men began to multiply, but the inspired penman speaks now of the fact which had taken place long before, as there is a distinction made here between men and those called the sons of God. Is generally supposed that the immediate posterity of Cain and that of Seth is intended. The first were men such as fallen nature may produce, degenerate race, degenerate sons of a degenerate father, governed by the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, and the pride of life. The others were sons of God, not angels, as some have dreamed, but such as were, according to our Lord's doctrine, born again, born from above, and made children of God by the influence of the Holy Spirit. The former were apostates from the true religion. The latter were those among whom it was preserved and cultivated. Dr. Wall supposes the first verses of that chapter should be paraphrased thus: when men began to multiply on the earth, chief men took wives of all the handsome and poor women they chose. They were tyrants in the earth in those days, and also after the antediluvian days, powerful men had unlawful connections with the inferior women, and the children which sprang up from the illicit commerce were the renowned heroes of antiquity, whom the heathen made their gods. This is Albert Barnes. Let's see. I'll start from the middle paragraph. It says, some take the daughters of men to be the daughters of the Canaanites only, but is sufficient to understand by this phrase of the daughters of men in general, without any distinction of moral or spiritual kind, and therefore including both Canaanite and Sethite females. They took themselves wives of all whom they chose. The evil here is described as the promiscuous intermarriage, without regard to spiritual character. The godly took the wives of all they chose, that is, ungodly as well as godly families, without any discrimination, whom they chose, not for godliness of their lives, but for the goodliness of their looks. Ungodly mothers will not train up children in the way they should go, and husbands who have taken the wrong step of marrying ungodly wives cannot prove to be very exemplary or authoritative fathers. Up to this time, they may have been consistent as the sons of God in their outward conduct, but laxity of the choice proves a corresponding laxity of principle. The first inlet of sin prepares the way of the floodgates of iniquity. It is easy to see how the degeneracy of the whole race will go on at a rapid pace. Here's the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. They're talking about the Nephilim. And it says here, and the mighty men born of the sons of God and the daughters of men are, according to the best interpretations, giants in wickedness, being the fruit of intermarriage between the descendants of Seth, sons of God, who called upon the name of the Lord, and the daughters of men. The idea that sons of God refers to angels or demigods has no support in Scripture. On this familiar designation of worshipers of the true God, and he goes through all the passages. And it says intermarriage with depraved races such as is imitated produced the results which guarded against the Mosaic law, prohibiting marriages with the surrounding idolatrous nations. The word Nephilim, and he mentions that. So in other words, he's making the point that the disintegration of society starts with this intermarriage, and these were men that did it. This is H.C. Leupold, who was a Lutheran. And this is what he says about the same thing here. We'll just read, let's see. Yes. We'll see. I'll read the whole thing. We have here just emphasized the fact that this is the closing probation of this particular history. Since this appears plainly as possible, if the headings of the parts of the book accepted on their face value as the natural marks of division, and if the literary unity of the book is adhered to, we would do foolishly to lose sight of the fact. Here now is the natural sequence of thought. After the Canaanites were observed to be going out in one definite direction in their development, and the Sethites too were seen in going in an entirely different direction, and these two streams of mankind were strictly keeping apart because they were so utterly divergent of character, now the two streams begin to commingle, and the result of moral distinctions are obliterated, and the Sethites too become so badly contaminated that the existing world order must be definitely terminated. Now the sons of God are found looking indiscriminately at this group and observing only the fact that the fair ones were to be seen in the whole group, that's all that they observed. They ask or care for nothing about anything else. Whether these fair ones were Sethite or Canaanite means nothing to them. That is the sad moral indifference that the author emphasizes. So notice, all these expositors make the same point, that when marriage is merely contracted based on the flesh, that is the looks, and no other reason, that is the beginning of the downfall of society, especially when the godly men do this, and even when godly women choose to do this. And are we seeing the results this day? I mean, that was back then. Are we seeing the results of this day? Is that just something that the Bible says? We're smarter now. We're more intelligent than we've ever been, and we don't know what a woman is anymore. Love is love. People can do whatever we want. Homosexuality is exciting these days. You're a hero if you do it. Like, this is the society we live in. Are we past what the Bible says? Is there no curse to doing this type of marriage? Is there no curse to choosing to love whatever we want without putting a regard to God? Well, absolutely, there is a curse to it, and we see it. This is a study that was done by the U.S. Department of Bureau of Statistics, or the U.S. Department of Justice and Statistics. And notice what they're going to talk about here, because this is what happens when the society falls apart. It starts right at marriage. So when we start at the beginning of creation, we start with male and female joined in a holy covenant with God through marriage. And then we have the building of children, and through children, we have the building of the church, and through children and the church, we have the building of society. And the point is that if we start to destroy marriage, we lose the society. That's what happens. We lose the home, we lose the church, and we lose society. That's the order. That is the goal, and it's happening. And so this is in 1987. Some of us weren't even alive then. But notice what it says here. An estimated 60.5% of juveniles and young adults between the ages of 15 and 17, 12.4% were the ages of 14 and younger, and 27% were the ages of 18 or age older. So this is the idea that children who grow up in divided homes or single-parent homes, 60% of these young adults between 15 and 18 were in prison, were in juvenile custody, who grew up in homes. And notice what it says here, about 70% of juveniles and young adults did not live with both parents. That means of all the kids in custody in the United States in juvenile detention, this is 1987, the population of kids in juvenile detention has swelled since then. And he says 70%, this is what the U.S. government, doesn't care about the Bible, says that 70% of juveniles and young adults did not live with both parents while they were growing up. And more than half, 54%, reported having primarily lived in a single-parent family. In other words, the likelihood that you're going to be imprisoned as a young child growing up in a single-family home is exponentially higher than if you grow up in a two-parent family. Starting right here in marriage, when that fails, your kids are more likely as children to go to jail. This is a dissertation that's done by Dr. Siddell, and it's great because they look at fatherlessness and crime. So I'm going to read you some of the findings in this dissertation by Siddell. This was published in 2021. It says, there is a father absence crisis in the United States. So think about all the excitement that we've done. We've told women, go be a boss. You don't need a husband. Go live your life. Go on vacations. And in the 90s, we were like, oh, it's cool to be a single mom. In the sitcoms, they were saying, oh, it's cool to be a single mom. It's cool to do all this and that. And we've celebrated it, we've exalted it, and yet men have, checked out, gotten into pornography and video games. So it's bad on every angle. But by having a fatherless home, notice what he says here. He's just talking about father absence, right? He says, there is a father absence crisis in the United States. The growing number of fatherless children in the United States poses a severe problem in education. Divorce and parental separation are harmful to children, families, and society, and the economy. Now, notice, if you look carefully here, this is a doctrine of psychology, not even theology, all right? And notice, this isn't like Andrews University. They would never do this there. This would be an anathema. This is not any university, any Christian university. This is the University of Arizona. This is a secular school, all right? So this is a secular school. They're just looking. They're just observing. They're not. This isn't people who woke up in the morning and were reading Genesis. There's some people just looking at the statistics, all right? So you have someone from a fake religion looking at what's happening, and I said that because it's psychology. It's a fake religion, just in case you were wondering. That's a sermon for another time. But he's looking at statistics, and look at what he's concluding. He's concluding that fatherlessness is destroying society. All right? He's not quoting Genesis. He's just looking at the statistics. And listen to what he says here. Divorce and parental separation are harmful to children, families, and society, and the economy. And he cites some things. He says, Anderson reported that nearly 25 million children have an absentee father. These children are 3 times more likely to end up in jail by the time they reach 30 years of age than children in traditional families and homes. Again, this is not from the Family Research Institute. This is not from any Christian university. This is a fake religion calling it like it is. And notice what he says here. Father departure later in childhood is associated with increased delinquency in juveniles, but not so much with more depressive symptoms. Now notice he goes on, he's not done. The whole dissertation is pretty interesting. He says, children reared in fatherless homes are more likely to commit crimes, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Fatherless sons are dramatically greater risk of criminality, fathering children as teenagers, subpar educational performance, suicide, mental illness, and the drug and alcohol abuse. He had to throw in mental illness. He is getting a doctorate in psychology, so he had to throw that in there. Daughters of single parents without fathers are 53% more likely to marry as teenagers. Now, I thought this was a mistake. I thought that it was 71%, but that's not what that says. And it's not 71.1%. That is 711%. That's 711. So notice what he says. He says 711% more likely to have children as teenagers. And that's not 16.1, and that's not 1.64. That's 164% more likely to have premarital birth, and 92% more likely to get divorced themselves. Illinois was home for the top 4 of the top 10 cities with the highest percentage of single mother-led households. Now, this is in Illinois where they don't need God, and they've come up with all these incredible policies about how we need to empower women, and we need to talk about diversity and all this other stuff. And yet they have some of the highest statistics in crime and misery. And this is only because of what? You've removed fathers from the home. We're just looking at one variable. One variable. Here's another study. This was published in 2010. This was published in 2010. All right. This is a peer-reviewed journal. And again, this isn't some Christian publication. It's just saying, it says this study investigated the risk factors of juvenile delinquency within the family structure, personality, and diagnostic variables in 75 juvenile delinquents referred to for forensic assessment. A considerable number of detrimental family characteristics were demonstrated. 66% of all juveniles had experienced father deprivation. That means no father in the house. 20% had never been living with their father, and 25% had an alcoholic father. That's right. So even if you're in the house, but you're drinking and you refuse to be a father, it's almost just as bad. But not as bad if you're not there, which is crazy. So even a father who's drunk laying on the couch is still a little bit better than a father not being there. It's just crazy that that's the fact. The most negative effects were registered in 32 juvenile delinquents growing up without a father and also reporting a negative relationship to their mother. These are kids who are in jail, and they're looking at all of them. Incredible how bad that is. This is actually from the Family Research Council in 2015. Now, they do have an axe to grind with the downfall of family, but they cite a lot of secular studies. So this is what they say. They said from the data from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services study of child abuse and neglect strongly imply that in many cases, absence of a biological father contributes to the increased risk of child maltreatment. The situation in which a child has the lowest risk of physical abuse. Now, I just want to stop right there. What they're talking about, so I want you to understand this. We have greatly we've used the word abuse. It's weird to say. We have abused the word abuse, all right? We've abused it. There are people who literally think that a father who tells his kid to make his bed is abuse. We literally think that a father tells his kid to do homework is abuse. We literally think that if someone says something awful to their spouse, that's abuse. That's not the definition here, okay? The definition here is when they take pictures and there's bruises, there's marks from being whipped with a hanger, there's broken bones. That's the definition here. So I don't want you to get it twisted when you're thinking about, well, I was abused one time. Someone said something mean to me. That's not the definition here, okay? I just had to say that because we've abused the word abuse. This means that you're getting your head stomped in by someone who's probably not your parent, all right? That's the idea. No kid should have to deal with that. But notice, in the 90s, they were exalting. There were sitcoms where they're like, oh, I'm going to be a single mom. It's going to be great. Oh, I can do it all on my own. It's going to be great. And we exalted that. And notice what he says here. They're saying that a child has the highest risk of abuse when they live in a single family home. That's what he's saying. And so notice he says the situation in which a child has the lowest risk of physical abuse is one in which the biological parents are married and the family has always been intact. Conversely, the risk of abuse is 3.5 times higher or more likely if the child is living with a single parent in a single parent household. Further, if the parent is cohabitating with another adult, the risk of abuse is multiplied by 10. Incredible. So this idea of being a single mom and inviting your boyfriend over is more likely to get your kid's head beat in than anything else by a factor of 10. Again, this is what we've done, and we've exalted this and said, no, we don't need women to be home and take care of kids. We don't need the traditional marriage. We don't need that. We can do what we want. We're too smart. Well, look at what it's caused in its wake. Here they go again. According to a 2003 study of 700 girls whose fathers left the family early in their lives had the highest rates of both early sexual activity and adolescent pregnancy, followed by those whose fathers left at a later age, followed by girls whose fathers were present. So notice, father gone, father leaves at an earlier age or later age, or fathers who are divorced from their mothers but are in their lives. It all goes by that. So the more active a father is involved, the better it is for daughter, the better it is for son, and probably even better for mom herself. In another study published in 2008 in which 90 families were observed, more exposure to father absence was linked with early puberty. Isn't that crazy? That even the hormones are messed up when you don't have a father in the house. Insane. Here's the graphs here from the actual study, which shows that there's earlier sexual activity, earlier pregnancy when fathers leave the home, both in the United States and New Zealand. So this just isn't a one-off. This is happening all over the world. And this brings us back here. This brings us back to Genesis. Well, I asked the question, and I was wondering, is it possible that what we see here in Genesis with the sons of God marrying the daughters of men is what Moses intends you to understand is the beginning of the downfall of society? And my answer is absolutely yes. Yes, it is. There's no angels. There's no aliens. That's not what brought down society. It was the destruction of the home. That's what brought down society. And that's why Moses puts it there. Moses could have put anything. He could have put anything. I'm sure he knew more of the sins that they committed than we do today. But he's like, no, if there's one thing I'm going to put, if there's one thing I want the reader to understand, I want them to understand that society collapses when marriage collapses. And all we have to do is look at these statistics today. We're seeing that exact same thing happening right now. But there is a solution to this, a solution that we have ignored to our own detriment. How many of you have heard about the fourth Elijah message? Now, I'm not going to get into it, but many of you probably have heard about it. Some of you have probably talked about it. This idea of the Elijah message. And many people believe, well, we're giving the Elijah message. We're warning the world, the three angels message and all this. And those are the three angels message is wonderful and right. And preaching the law is wonderful and right. And telling the people about God and Jesus Christ soon coming is wonderful and right. But there's something that we have ignored to our own detriment. And I want you to see it here in Malachi. All right? So here we are, Malachi chapter 4, verse 4. Remember the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded in Horeb in all of Israel, with the statutes and with statutes and judgments. So notice, he's talking about the end, and he's talking about Moses, and then he's talking about the law, and this is important. And then he says, verse 5, behold, I will send Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Now, I just want you to understand this. This is a promise that he's going to send him, that we need to remember the law of God. We need to remember what Moses has taught. But God is going to send Elijah again, the prophet, who's going to come before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And yes, in a sense, John the Baptist very much was that Elijah. Jesus says it himself. But there's still a presence of Elijah that's going to happen again. And notice what he's going to do. He doesn't say, and it's not because it isn't important, he isn't going to preach the three angels message. He doesn't say that. And he isn't going to talk about Daniel 2. Those things are very important, all right? I'm not minimizing those. The reason why I'm saying this is because we as a people have minimized this. We have minimized this. We have ignored this. We've ignored what is said right here. It's plain as day. Notice what he says. Before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and this is the Elijah message, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the hearts of the children to their fathers. That's what he says here. This is something we've ignored. And all of our preaching about Daniel 2, about Revelation 13, the beast, the mark, and all of it needs to be done. I'm all on board for it. As a matter of fact, I hope to be doing that soon. But we have ignored this very thing, and it has eaten us up alive. We wonder why we have so many children coming out of the closet gay. We wonder why we have so many broken families and so many divorces and so many problems and such a dysfunctional hierarchy in leadership. It's because we've ignored the home. And notice what he says here. And this is not a conditional thing. Well, this is a conditional thing, but it is as much of a promise. Notice what he says here. Lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. Are we seeing the curse? Are we tasting the curse? I know I've seen it in my own home, in my own life. You see it in communities. You see it in people falling apart, that this is what we have ignored to our own detriment. And until we get the home right, until we get on our knees and we consecrate ourselves to the Lord, and if we're married, consecrate our marriage and consecrate our children, until we start doing that, all the other preaching, well, a lot of it will just be hot gas in a wind. It's got to come back to the home because that's where it originally started. That is the ultimate truth about the Nephilim, is the downfall of society didn't begin with a one-off doctrine. It began with a compromise of the home. And that is where we have to fix it. Amen. Thank you.